All right. My name is Michael Motley. I go by Country Boy. I'm from the One Mic Black History podcast. You can find my podcast, onemichistory.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can donate to my Patreon and buy me coffee at onemichistory.com, and then click support. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and get started because I got a tight 20 minutes. All right. In 1895, Booker T. Washington delivered his famous Atlanta Compromise speech at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta. Washington's speech responded to the Negro problem in America and basically stated that Reconstruction and enfranchising the Negro had been a failure. But Washington promised his audience that he would encourage Blacks to become proficient in agriculture and mechanics and commerce and domestic service. And his speech was steeped in Protestant values and his accommodationist approach to African Americans. Washington also eased white America's fears about Blacks' desire for social integration by stating that both races could be as separate as the fingers, but come together as one like the hand for all things essential for mutual progress. The speech was greeted with thunderous applause and was given a standing ovation. The Atlanta Constitution stated that it was the beginning of a moral revolution in America, and Washington's words were telegraphed to every major newspaper in the country and was greeted enthusiastically by both Northern Southern whites and African American leaders. The sudden fame thrusted upon Booker T. Washington gained in Atlanta thrusted him to the forefront of Blacks looking for a new leader with the passing of Frederick Douglass earlier in 1895. Douglass's death and the lack of other viable candidates led to Washington being thrusted into the position as the leader of African Americans, and he would accept this position without hesitation. He would use this position to become an advisor to President Theodore Roosevelt in 1901. Roosevelt felt that Washington was a brilliant advisor on racial matters, and shortly after Roosevelt was inaugurated, he invited Booker T. Washington to dine with him and his family at the White House. The visit was met with an outpouring of condemnation from Southern Republicans and the Southern press. Senator Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina would state, "We shall have to kill 1,000 niggas to put them back in their place." And no other African American was invited to the White House for over 30 years. It was at this time that Booker T. Washington met a man by the name of William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. These two had a working relationship because Du Bois was a professor by trade, having graduated from Harvard University with his PhD. And he applied for a job at Tuskegee Institute, at which Washington was the founder, before deciding to go work at Wilberforce University. But in the following years, Du Bois would become increasingly disenfranchised and disenchanted by what he saw was a failure of leadership from Washington and the Tuskegee machine. So much so that in 1900, when a Chicago book publishing company asked Du Bois to write a book, in 1903, he released The Souls of Black Folks, and it was his magnum opus and his greatest literary achievement. It was a collection of 15 previously unreleased pieces about rural Black life and observations on the African American experience. But it also offered a sharp criticism of Booker T. Washington, and it declared that Washington was a Black leader chosen by white America, having foregone African Americans' political rights for the opportunity for economic advancement. He also stated that Washington's ideology practically accepted the inferiority of the Negro while refusing to denounce racial injustice and white violence. Du Bois would become so disenchanted by the leadership of Booker T. Washington that he would even form his own civil rights organization with him and other African American leaders. It was called the Niagara Movement. The Niagara Movement was firmly opposed to the accommodationist conservative platform of Booker T. Washington. And they would meet annually from 1905 to around 1908. And although the Niagara Movement had very little impact on legislation or popular opinion, it did change the lives of African Americans, but a little bit more on that later. The problem with Washington's leadership could be summed up in two major incidents that happened in 1906. The first being the Atlanta riot, which killed more than 20 African Americans and burned more than 1,000 homes and businesses. Washington was worried that indiscriminate condemnation of violence would provoke further backlash and incite more violence. Washington would state that blacks should focus more on their white friends than the whites that wish to do them evil. Now, this fell on deaf ears. No one was attempting to hear that, and it simply galvanized critics against Washington and severely damaged his standing as the official leader of African Americans. But Washington's greatest transgression was his relationship and his trust in Theodore Roosevelt. In 1906, the Brownsville affair would also happen. It was the all-black 25th Regiment was stationed in Brownsville, Texas, when on August 12th, a white bartender was killed and a white police officer was wounded in gunfire. The white residents of Brownsville, Texas, were already held a resentment of the 25th Regiment because what they saw was an invasion by the black soldiers. So with racial tensions already high, the town's members accused the 25th Regiment of the violence, although their commanding officer stated that the soldiers had been in their barracks the entire night. Roosevelt would have all 167 members of the 25th Regiment dishonorably discharged, and Booker T. Washington would plead with Roosevelt not to act until they had a further investigation. Roosevelt would simply state that he could not refrain from firing the soldiers and basically stated that Booker T. Washington needed to stay in his place. With these back-to-back disasters, with the Atlanta riot and the Brownsville injustice, it marked a tragic end for the leadership of Booker T. Washington. Washington would continue on as an advisor to subsequent presidents, but he would retire to Tuskegee Institute until his death in 1915. As Washington's leadership began to wane, the influence of W.B. Du Bois would increase. When another race riot broke out in Springfield, Illinois, killing 8 blacks and displacing 2,000 other African Americans, the members of the Negro Movement felt that a more powerful interracial organization was needed to combat racism. And out of this concern birthed the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Now, the NAACP was an interracial organization, but the executive leadership at the time was entirely white, with the exception of one man, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. He was brought in as the director of publicity and of research, and he was the editor of The Crisis, which was the official magazine of the NAACP. And Du Bois would use the magazine as his personal journal to speak out against violence against African Americans and discuss the black experience. For instance, when America joined World War I in 1917, Du Bois asked African Americans, while the war lasts, blacks should forget their special grievances and close ranks shoulder to shoulder with fellow white citizens and allied nations and fight for democracy. And 350,000 African Americans would join the war effort. Now, while majority of those black soldiers were assigned as labor and as stevedores, they still joined the call because they wanted to show that they earned the right to be equal, and they were willing to go to war to prove they were worthy of full citizenship. But after going to war, after the war and after risking their lives for democracy, they came home to find that they were still going to be denied basic human decency. But worse yet, African-American veterans were a particular threat to Jim Crow and racial subjugation, and many veterans were accosted simply for wearing their uniforms. Others were physically attacked, and at least 13 were lynched. In the face of this injustice, many African-American soldiers returned with a renewed determination to fight against segregation and the constant barrage of violence and brutality. Meanwhile, during this same time, the Great Migration was happening. The Great Migration was the mass migration of 1.6 million African Americans from the Jim Crow South to northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, DC, and New York. It would take place during the turn of the century, but when World War I broke out in 1914, it would put an end to the steady tide of European immigrants into the United States, causing a shortage of cheap labor in those industrialized towns. With the wrapping up of the war effort, northern manufacturers turned to southern blacks for cheap labor. And southern blacks faced an almost intolerable social situation under Jim Crow because it controlled every aspect of their lives. While the North provided them with job opportunities, the chance for better pay, and the opportunity for basic human decency, some businesses even would pay for the travel expenses. African Americans would use magazines like The Crisis, like the Chicago Defender, to inspire themselves to what life would be like in those northern cities. But once they arrived in those urban areas, Black migrants were once again faced with widespread racism, injustice, competition for jobs and housing. The housing crisis was made even worse for African Americans because of segregationist policies. The outpouring of Blacks into the North caused angry groups of white Americans in these major cities to lobby for laws to prohibit landlords from renting to Blacks in their neighborhoods. And they used restrictive covenants to prevent homeowners from selling to a specific minority. And with the rising tensions in America, violence would explode in the year of 1919. The Red Summer of 1919 was a series of at least 25 race riots that took place in cities all across the United States, spanning at least 10 months and killing more than 250 African Americans. The name was coined by the field secretary of the NAACP, James Weldon Johnson, and the riots developed from post-war demobilization of the military, an economic slump, and extreme competition for jobs and housing, and just general resentment from white Americans. The Red Summer did mark a shift in the way African Americans responded to violence in the United States, and they pushed for increased self-defense tactics, including African American veterans mobilized against violence using their government-provided weapons training to defend their neighborhoods against vicious mobs. And in turn, these white mobs created their own worst fears in weaponizing African American veterans. Additionally, the Russian Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 caused the United States to view African Americans' advocacy for racial equality and how they responded to that violence with great alarm. President Woodrow Wilson would state that the American Negro returning from abroad is the greatest medium for conveying Bolshevikism in America. And white Americans would use communism as a scapegoat to explain away the violence of the Red Summer. Still, African Americans in these urban areas after the Red Summer felt that they were better off in these northern cities than they had ever been in the Jim Crow South. But the discrimination and violence that they faced caused a philosophical change from the more accommodationist approach of Booker T. Washington to the more militant advocacy of W.E.B. Du Bois. As a semi-positive result of the housing crisis, Blacks in these areas created their own cities within the big cities, fostering an explosion of urban African American culture. Most notably was the Harlem Renaissance. In 1900, a few Black families moved from Black Bohemia in Midtown Manhattan to Harlem, which at the time was a upper middle class, all-white neighborhood. As other Black families followed, the white residents initially fought against African Americans moving into the area, but as they failed, the residents fled from Harlem as their housing prices plummeted. The irony of this is that by 1920, the Black-owned property in Harlem was valued over $200 million, which would be worth $1.8 billion in today's money. The Black Renaissance was a cultural, social, and artistic explosion that took place in northern urban areas. During this period, Harlem was its cultural center, drawing Black writers, artists, musicians, photographers, poets, and scholars. Many of them fleeing from the South from the oppressive Jim Crow caste system in order to find a place where they could freely express their artistic talents. W.E.B. Du Bois encouraged artists to leave the South, and because Du Bois was the editor of The Crisis, and he was at the height of his fame and influence on the Black community, Du Bois would ensure that Black Americans got the credit they deserved for their cultural work, and The Crisis published poems, stories, and visual artworks from artists like Langston Hughes and Aaron Douglas. But the Black Renaissance wasn't just about an artistic explosion. It involved racial pride. The New Negro Movement demanded civil and political rights. The New Negro Movement was an effort to define what it meant to be African American by African Americans rather than degrading stereotypes and caricatures created by someone else. The New Negro Movement felt that African Americans were opposed to assert their own culture and politics instead of becoming a problem or a formula for white America to debate about. The New Negro was coined by Alan Locke in his anthology, The New Negro. One of the reoccurring themes was the distinction between the old world and the new world, and Locke points out the significance of Harlem and explains what it stood for by stating that it was a racial awakening, perhaps on a national, even world scale. The NAACP also played a major role in this cultural awakening. The NAACP provided financial support, aesthetic guidance, and literature that led to this awakening. The NAACP membership in 1917 was only 9,000, but by the early 20s, it was over 100,000 members. And the NAACP became the civil rights organization of choice by African Americans and signaled a growing boldness and cohesion amongst African Americans. The Harlem Renaissance was successful because it brought the Black experience to American culture, and the Harlem Inner Renaissance was a golden age for Black artists, writers, and musicians, and it gave these artists control over how the Black experience will be represented in American culture. But the greatest impact of the New Negro Movement and the Harlem Renaissance was its reinforcement of racial pride amongst African Americans. And with that new pride, motivation, and ambition, it planted the seeds for the Civil Rights Movement. There could not be a Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X or Rosa Parks without Booker T. Washington or William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, or the men that fought in World War I, or the artists, writers, and musicians of the Black Renaissance. Thank you. That's been my talk. We're about kind of fast.